All right, let's jump right in. What happens when we die? It's maybe the biggest question there is. For this explainer, we're not going to guess. We're going to follow one specific path right through the Bible to see what it says about life, death, and what comes after. So let's get into it.
So, what does the Bible say happens the very moment we die? This is the core question, right? For the next few minutes, try to put aside everything you think you know. We're just going to let these ancient texts speak for themselves and see how they describe that moment and what comes next.
Okay, so to really get a handle on what these texts say about death, we've actually got to rewind. We have to go all the way back to the beginning, to their origin story for how life even started.
And right away, in the book of Genesis, we hit this really key idea that might not be what you're expecting. You see, according to this text, a living soul isn't something you have, like a little ghost living inside your body. No, it's something you are. It's what you become when two very specific elements come together.
And here it is. It's like a simple equation. You've got the dust of the ground. That's the physical stuff, our bodies. And then you have the breath of life, this life force from God. When you put them together, boom, you get a living soul. The big point here is that the body and breath aren't just a container for a soul. Their combination is the living, breathing person.
So it only makes sense that at death, this whole process just goes in reverse. The body goes back to the dust where it came from. And that spirit, which is that breath of life, it goes back to God who gave it. The person, that living soul, well, it's no longer a complete unit. It stops existing once those two parts are separated.
Okay, so if the living soul is this combination of body and breath, what actually happens when they get pulled apart? What is the state of death itself like? Well, as we look through these texts, you see them coming back to one powerful metaphor again and again.
So what is this state? Is it some journey to another world? An instant review of your life? Well, the verses we're about to look at describe something else entirely.
And what they paint is a picture of, well, of nothing.
Total unconsciousness. Your thoughts are gone. You know nothing. You're not even aware of what's happening to your loved ones on earth. The theme that keeps popping up is just silence. A total lack of awareness.
And this is where we see that metaphor for the first time. Listen to what King David says in the Psalms. He doesn't say, "Don't let my soul go to the underworld." He says, "Lest I sleep the sleep of death." He's pleading with God to save him from this sleep.
And this isn't just a one-off thing. The book of Job uses the exact same language. It talks about a person lying down in death and not being roused from their sleep, at least not until a certain time in the future.
And then we get to the New Testament, and the metaphor becomes crystal clear. When Jesus is talking about his friend Lazarus, who had died, his first words are, "Our friend Lazarus sleeps." Now, his disciples are totally confused by this, so he has to spell it out for them. He says, plainly, Lazarus is dead. So for Jesus, sleep wasn't just some nice poetry. It was the best word to describe this temporary state before an awakening.
And it doesn't stop there. The Apostle Paul picks up this exact same idea. When he writes about believers who've passed away, he doesn't say they're in heaven enjoying their reward. He says they sleep in Jesus. They're waiting for something to happen in the future.
All right. So if death is just a sleep, the obvious next question is, when's the alarm clock go off? When's the wake-up call?
And that brings us to the promise that's really at the core of this whole thing, the resurrection.
So when does this wake-up call happen? Well, in the Gospel of John, the promise isn't about getting your reward the second you die. No, the hope is all tied to being raised up at a very specific point in time, the last day. And Paul gives us this incredible step-by-step picture of what this great reunion looks like. First, the Lord descends. There's a shout, a trumpet call. And what's the very next thing? The dead in Christ, the ones who are sleeping, they rise first. Only after that do the believers who are still alive get caught up to join them. And that, according to Paul, is the moment they are all finally with the Lord forever.
So this timeline really pulls it all together. Right now, it's about living by faith, being, as Paul says, absent from the Lord. The reward, Jesus says that comes at his coming. And when does that reward get paid out? Luke's gospel says, specifically, at the resurrection of the just. See the pattern? The timeline consistently points to one future moment.
But what does this resurrected state even look like? The texts we're looking at say it's way more than just waking up from a nap. It's a total, fundamental transformation from one kind of being
to another. Paul uses this brilliant analogy of getting dressed. He says the goal isn't to be unclothed, to be a spirit floating around without a body. The hope is to be further clothed, to get a brand new, upgraded, immortal body, so that this fragile mortality we have now is just completely swallowed up by life.
Think of it like a massive upgrade, a real trade-up from something temporary to something that lasts forever. Our current bodies, they're described as being like a flimsy, temporary tent. But the new one? It's a permanent habitation, a home where death can't even get a foot in the door. And how fast does all this happen? The text is super clear about this. It is not a slow process. It happens in a moment, in the twinkling of an eye. It's instantaneous. It's triggered by the sound of the last trumpet. Just a sudden, final, world-changing event.
And this is the grand finale. This is where this whole story has been building. In that moment of transformation, the texts declare that the final enemy, death itself, is utterly and completely defeated. It is, quote, swallowed up in victory.
So, let's wrap it up with this thought. If you follow this specific thread through the Bible, death isn't a doorway to another realm, it's an unconscious sleep. And the hope isn't for an immediate afterlife, but for a future resurrection. So if that's the narrative, if death is just a temporary problem that has a final, victorious solution, how does that reframe the meaning of the life we're all living, right here, right now? That's the real question, isn't it?